purpose of Psalm 4 is to show us that when people rebel against God's anointed king, it's not something that lasts just for a few hours or even a day. It's something that can go on for a very long time. And you almost sense David's physical and emotional and mental exhaustion because of the rebellion of his enemies. And he actually addresses them in verse 2, which is interesting because it shows us the psalmists don't just pray to God, but many times they turn and they speak to their enemies, or they turn and they speak to their righteous supporters. But here he speaks to his enemies in verse 2 and says, "How long will you continue, instead of honoring me, to bring shame and reproach down upon me? How long will you continue to believe lies about me?" And Psalm 4 is more of an evening prayer, whereas Psalm 3 was a morning prayer. In Psalm 3, he woke up in the morning and realized God had delivered him and kept him safe. But in Psalm 4, it's like he's laying down in bed at the end of a very long and exhausting day because of the relentless troubles caused by his enemies, and he's trying to find peace. And it's hard to, because it seems like the persecution of his enemies is just lasting forever. So there's some debate over verses 4 and 5 as to whether he's speaking to his enemies or to himself. If he's speaking to his enemies, he's telling them, look, God is going to deliver me. David actually has confidence. He says in verse 3, the Lord hears when I call to him. And so if he's speaking to his enemies, he's telling them, just stay home and stop sinning against the Lord's anointed. I mean, even David himself, when he had opportunity to kill Saul on a couple occasions, even though David was the real anointed king, Saul was technically still on the throne, and he still refused to kill Saul because he didn't want to sin against God's anointed. And so he's telling his enemies, stop sinning against God's anointed, because according to Psalm 2, that's not going to go well for you. You're going to end up shattered like earthenware. But if he's speaking to himself, well, now he's trying to get himself not to take vengeance on his enemies. That when you're being persecuted, it's very tempting, maybe for David, to be filled with bitterness and hatred toward his enemies and to take matters into his own hands and just go slaughter all of them. Instead, he's saying, tremble. Whether I'm feeling anger or fear, I'm just going to process that with God in prayer on my bed, and I'm not going to allow it to cause me to sin. I'm going to meditate on the goodness of God and his word. I'm going to pray to him. I'm going to continue doing the right thing and trusting in the Lord and his timing. And that is how David finds peace. In fact, in verse 8, that's how it ends, that in peace I will both lie down and sleep. And that's the practice for us, because we may not be the anointed of God, but he mentions in verse 3, God has set apart the godly man for himself. So this applies to all godly men and women. And as Christians, we are absolutely going to face people who hate us, who slander us, who try to make our lives miserable. And we might be tempted to be filled with hatred and bitterness and resentment toward them, and even to lash out against them in sin. And so we need to speak these words to ourselves and realize, no, I need to tremble in whatever emotions are going on, fear, anger, resentment. I need to deal with that and process that with God in prayer. I need to meditate on him, on his goodness and on his law, and I need to trust him in his timing. As far as prophecy goes, think about Jesus. All the opposition he faced for 3 long years. How long that must have felt for Jesus to deal with the persecution from the Pharisees, slandering his name, saying that he was casting out demons by the ruler of demons, and painting him as the bad guy for healing people on the Sabbath day, and eventually plotting his death and putting him on a cross. And yet Jesus never once allowed their sins against him to cause him to sin against them. Instead, Jesus trusted in the Lord and refused to take matters into his own hands. And as far as praise to God, we praise him because we know he's going to take care of us no matter how long it seems like our suffering is lasting. Even if it seems like we're undergoing this ordeal from our enemies forever, it's not forever. God will absolutely come through for us. God hears when we call to him. And so that's our prayer today. Lord, help me when I'm facing opposition from people who hate you and who hate me. Please let me not be filled with bitterness and hatred. Let me leave all of this in your hands to deal with in your way and in your timing, and to know that you are in control. Help me to fill my mind and heart with your goodness and not with the evil of my enemies or the pain of my problems. And Father, grant me gladness in my heart and peaceful sleep.